The Dutch invasions of northeastern Brazil are often immediately linked to Mauricio de Nassaus' achievements and about the prosperity of Recife. But what is rarely mentioned is the prosperity of Pernambuco before the Dutch, and this raises some important questions. How rich was this captaincy after all? What was its importance in the Portuguese overseas empire, and why did the Dutch completely destroy, loot, and burn down a city in Pernambuco? In today's video, we explore how the Portuguese castle in the northeast became one of the wealthiest places in the southern hemisphere, and why it was completely destroyed by the Dutch. And if history is made by those who draw the maps, it is also undone by those who tear up the books. In the 20th century, totalitarian regimes erased people's memories. That's why you should check out Caravella's Publishing's latest campaign now. There are 3 books and over 1,000 pages to explore the Holodomor and Soviet agriculture's collapse, the myth behind Vladimir Lenin, and also about the Soviet persecution of the Catholic religion. By purchasing these works, you also get access to 2 exclusive courses by Professor Marcelo Andrade and a masterclass with Professor Alison Nunato. But this campaign is for a limited time. By securing this combo by July 22nd, you can get up to 40% off with free shipping. So don't waste time, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen and dive even deeper. Communism's effects with Editora Caravelas. The captaincy of Pernambuco was one of the few that prospered under King Dom João III's hereditary captaincy system. Its captain, Duarte Coelho, arrived in 1535 with an extremely hostile land, where he had to fight early on with the Tabajara Indians and founded the island of Guaraçu. Duarte arrived in the northeast with an entourage full of families from northern Portugal. And faced with so many hostile Indians, he quickly set about building a strong house, a castle in the heart of 16th century Brazil, where the newly arrived Portuguese could settle and survive in that place, protected from the Indians. Like most medieval castles, it stood atop a hill. To observe the movement in the surroundings, Duarte soon sets out for a hill near the coast to establish his castle. Contemplating the beauty of his captaincy from there, he is said to have said, "Oh, what a beautiful place to found a village." And that's how the city of Olinda was founded, right in the middle of that beautiful place, and around the strong house built by the Donatario. The constant state of war with the native Tabajaras would end when Geronimo de Albuquerque, the Donatario's brother-in-law, was captured by the Tabajaras and was about to be eaten in a cannibalistic ritual. But he was saved by the chief's daughter, Muira Ubi, who fell in love with him and married the Portuguese. The couple had 8 children, and after Muira Ubi died, Geronimo fathered over 100 more, many indigenous and Portuguese women. And he even received a warning from the Queen of Portugal because of his reputation as a womanizer and lustful Geronimo. Descended from King Dom Denis, he would not only become known as the Pernambucan Adam, but would also begin the construction of the first sugar mills in the captaincy, especially the one of Nossa Senhora da Ajuda. And the sugar mills were the first factories in Brazil. Instead of mere botanical or mineral extraction, the Portuguese gradually set up a solid sugar industry at a time when sugar was an extremely valuable item in Europe. The Dutch financed many of these mills because while they bought Portuguese sugar, they also refined and sold it in Europe. The commercial partnership was good for both parties. That's because, while the Dutch profited a lot from distribution and refining, the Portuguese not only got funding for more mills, but could also, day by day, expand their activity through a much simpler process. Instead of dividing 20 slaves into 10 different tasks, the mill owner divided those same 20 slaves into 5 different, much simpler tasks, thus allowing the quantity of the base product to be much greater. This is directly reflected in the captaincy's prosperity. Pernambuco had 11 Portuguese towns and settlements, all of them productive. By 1580, Pernambuco's 60 sugar mills produced half of Brazil's sugar. 11 years later, 18 new sugar mills had been built, and by 1623, 32 years later, there were 60 more, totaling 137 mills operating. This does not include the small mills, the little sugar mills that also produce sugar in smaller quantities. In 1625, Portugal supplied all of Europe with sugar from Brazil, and a large part of that sugar came precisely from the captaincy of Pernambuco. The wealth of the captaincy was directly reflected in the splendor of its capital, Olinda, which stood out as the sweet jewel of Brazil and had an important infrastructure. Founded in 1540, the Santa Casa de Olinda was Brazil's first hospital. Gaspar Barleo, in his accounts, described Olinda in 1537 as a village of beautiful buildings and temples, especially the convent, which he defined as an elegant construction rich in lacework. Slaves in Olinda formed the Brotherhood of Our Lady of the Rosary of Black Men to organize celebrations like the Congada and processions, and also to build churches, such as the Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe or the Church of Our Lady of the Rosary of Black Men. Recife, in turn, was also emerging as a wealthy place, especially because it had the port and thus shipped out the riches of Pernambuco. But it couldn't compare to the aristocratic air of Olinda, which was more protected inland. The Jesuit Fernão Cardim, impressed by the splendor of Pernambuco, described that the plantations are larger and richer than those in Bahia, which was the capital of Brazil, and the banquets always had extraordinary delicacies. He concluded by famously saying that Pernambuco has more vanity than Lisbon, capturing its opulence. But everything would change. In the deserts of Alcácer Quibir, King Dom Sebastião dies in Morocco in a crusade against an army 3 times larger than his own. And what's interesting is that Dom Sebastião summons the greatest nobles of the kingdom for this battle. Among them is Jorge de Albuquerque Coelho, Donatário of Pernambuco, and son of Duarte Coelho. After the King of Portugal died with no heirs, Felipe II of Castile inherited the throne and started the Iberian Union. In this way, Portugal would come to be under the reign of a Spanish monarch, even though it maintained its autonomy as a kingdom. But the union with Spain would greatly affect the dynamics of the captaincy of Pernambuco. That's because the Spanish were enemies of the English, French, Dutch, some Germans, and also the Ottomans. In other words, Spain was an enemy of much of Europe, and since Portugal was now in an alliance with Castile and under the same king, it also became an enemy of all those countries. It didn't take long for trade with the Dutch to be banned by Philip II. As a result, Brazil became a target for Castile's enemies, and this rich target would be attacked through the practice of piracy. In 1596, the English privateer James Lancaster carried out one of the biggest raids in the history of Recife, with an expedition aimed exclusively at Brazil. He joins. French and Dutch vessels, along with a grand invasion force, plundered the captaincy of Pernambuco for an entire month. The plundering was an overwhelming success. The English, French, and Dutch troops plundered Brazil wood, sugar, cotton, as well as the cargo from the ship São Paulo, which had just arrived from India. It was full of spices. According to Jean-Marcel Carvalho, in his work about the pirates of Brazil, this was by far the biggest loot of the Elizabethan era and one of the largest in the history of England. More than 40 ships loaded with riches stolen from Pernambuco arrived at English ports with extremely high resale value. The profit was huge, filling the English crown's coffers. And what's interesting to note is that the Dutch invasion policy at that time prioritized capturing regions that were already prosperous. For example, the Dutch had already discovered Australia in 1606, but they refused to settle there, even though it was the size of a continent. That's because they saw no value in those lands. The Dutch didn't want to build a colony from scratch. They just wanted to raid and take over a settlement that was already prosperous and established. That's how they tried to take over the largest city in the southern hemisphere, the city of Salvador, the capital of Brazil, in 1624. And after their failure, they now turned to try to take the captaincy of Pernambuco. The Dutch landed in Pernambuco with a powerful fleet and many soldiers to effectively occupy the region. The forts in Pernambuco were not adequate to protect the captaincy and easily succumbed. Thus, Governor Matias de Albuquerque, who was the grandson of Duarte Coelho, soon left for Salvador to seek support to defend his captaincy. And Matias would set up a guerrilla system to torment the invaders. Ambrosio Richthofer, who fought in the Dutch East India Company, reports in his diary the difficulties the Dutch had in settling. 3 men from his regiment, who went to pick fruit in the woods, were killed by the Brazilian guerrillas. The food meant for 8 days lasted only 2, so the Dutch had to eat dogs and cats. Like Olinda, it was a city built on a hill and had irregular architecture, making it difficult to demolish and fortify the city to protect it from guerrilla attacks. One thing was the fort, initially built by Duarte Coelho, which was cohesive, and another was the city that had developed around it. The city, open on many sides, was easily attacked by the Brazilica guerrillas, and the Dutch who stayed there died almost every day. Even the short trip from Olinda to Recife, just over 10 kilometers, it was not immune to the guerrillas, who inflicted heavy losses on the Dutch and disappeared into the forest. And that's when the greatest disasters of the Dutch occupation happened. Seeing that Olinda was difficult to protect from the guerrillas, the Dutch decided to move their capital to Recife, which would be called Mauricia City, and decided to completely burn down the city of Olinda. Olinda was not just a capital, but a symbolic landmark. It was a representation of the Portuguese rule that had already passed and showed its splendor in the beautiful buildings that adorned the city. For the Dutch, it was necessary to forget all of that, and of course to destroy the Catholic temples. Thus, the invaders destroyed the convent of São Francisco de Olinda, with all its tiles, paintings, and Baroque ornaments, and also beheaded all the statues. The Santa Casa de Misericordia of Olinda would not be spared. It was looted by the Dutch in 1630 and set on fire by them the following year. All this, along with most houses and buildings burned by the Batavians. Diogo Lopes Santiago, who witnessed the event, describes the destruction of the city. The chronicler says that setting fire everywhere, it was a miserable spectacle. Thus burned the unfortunate town of Olinda, so renowned for its wealth and noble buildings. Its famous temples burned, as well as houses that had cost thousands of cruzados to build them. Without pity, the inhuman Dutchmen set fire to such a grand town. And the most curious thing is that the Dutch themselves recognized the beauty of those Portuguese buildings. Gaspar Barleos, despite harshly criticizing the Portuguese, acknowledges in his writings the beauty of the ornaments in the churches of Olinda, and even famous painters like Franz Post, sponsored by Nassau, never tired of portraying the ruins of Olinda, whose mere rubble already showed the ornaments it once had. In Spain, King Felipe IV watched with anger the speed of the Dutch domination. Meanwhile, the crown of Castile was out of money. The king limited himself to sending just a few ships to Governor Matias de Albuquerque, aiming to help supply the guerrillas of the captaincy. Unlike the Vassals campaign, in which the Spanish and Portuguese sent 50 ships to reconquer Salvador. That year, the royal treasury was empty. Exhausted by the 30 Years' War, Europe's largest conflict, and the 80 Years' War with the Dutch, with the king being neck-deep in debt. But the Portuguese in Brazil strongly resisted the invaders. Matias de Albuquerque quickly set up a perimeter of fortresses to prevent Dutch expansion. 3 days after the burning of Olinda, the Dutch tried to conquer Paraíba, but they were harshly repelled at the Cabedelo fort, giving up on conquering it for the time being. And the most heroic resistance took place at the Rio Formoso fort. There, the Dutch, with 600 men, attacked the Portuguese fort, which refused to surrender and fought fiercely against the Batavians. Until, after hours of intense combat, the gunfire suddenly stops. And when the Dutch enter the fort, expecting to find hundreds of surrendered men, they discover that the entire fort had only 20 defenders, all of them dead, and only the commander, Pedro de Albuquerque, still alive but gravely wounded. Even with an army 30 times smaller, the Portuguese resisted and fought to the last man in an act of heroism that was recognized by the Dutch. But this occupation would not last forever. The Portuguese would not only continue using guerrilla tactics, but would later assemble entire armies against the Dutch in a rare moment in history when whites, blacks, and indigenous people fought together against the same enemy. That's a topic for future videos on this channel. And you? What surprised you the most? Did you know about the sack of Olinda and the destruction by the Dutch? So, leave your comment right now to support our work, and if you want to see us continue, consider becoming a member of the channel right now. That way you'll be able to dive deeper, support us, and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.